Going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy. I am the Director of Professional Development here at SAES, and we're so honored to have you today. I'm joined by Andrew Wooden, our Interim Executive Director, and this is Best Practices of High Performing Boards. So we want to welcome you and take care of a good few housekeeping items before we begin. First of all, I want you to know that everyone will receive the link to this webinar. It is being recorded, so it usually takes a little bit of time to get that link from Zoom. So as soon as we have it available, we'll get that to you. You'll also receive copies of tonight's slide deck. And so you can take notes if you'd like, but you don't have to. We want you to engage in the chat and ask lots and lots of questions that hopefully we can answer. Two ways that you can do that. We kind of asked you to do some chatting in the beginning, but you can also look at the bottom of your screen and there's a Q&A box. So let's go ahead and make sure that that Q&A box works. Go ahead and put in a few things in the Q&A box, maybe again, where you're from, what your name is, so that we can see that the Q&A box is working. Want to make sure that you know that we want you to be engaged in this process. This is really important. There it is. That's working. It's really important that we understand the questions that you need answered. And so we want you to ask those questions. You can put them in the chat. You can put them in the Q&A. Probably the Q&A is the best. That's the one I'm going to be watching the most, so I'll not miss it in the chat. So be sure you put it in and we will get to it. Finally, I just want to say thank you for being here. This being a board member of an Episcopal school in the last year and a half has been challenging at best. And we just are thankful that you said yes to that call. And we're thankful that you're on your board, and want to welcome the heads of schools that are here and acknowledge the work that they've been doing that's been difficult at best. And just want to say thanks. And we're excited you're here. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen here. As I said before, this is Best Practices of High Performing Boards. Most of you, some of you may know me, some of you may not, but I want to kind of give you a little background on me. I have been the Director of Professional Development for the last couple of years here at SAES, but prior to that, I was the head of school here in Harlingen, Texas at St. Albans Episcopal Day School. I served 17 years as the head of school. We had students from preschool all the way through 6th grade, and it was a wonderful time. I retired a couple of years ago to do this work and have loved doing this work as well. So I have some experience working with boards. I've experienced working with some that were really high performing and some that were not. So what I hope to do tonight is to give you some thoughts around what it means to be a high performing board. And Andrew has a lot of experience as well. Andrew, tell us a little bit before we get started, since I talked a little bit about myself. Tell us what your experience is with boards.
Sure. Well, first of all, I've spent most of my career as a head of school. I've headed 6 different independent schools and obviously interacted with all those boards. But I'm also chair a nonprofit educational board in Connecticut, and I'm an executive member of the Bishop School Board in La Jolla, California. So I think I've spent actually probably more time on the board side of the desk than as a head, but I see both points of view. And I think the most important thing is how strong a partnership you can create between the head and the board.
Right. I agree. All right, so let's get started here. So tonight we're going to be talking about a couple of things, and we're going to put these two concepts. One is the SAES vital signs, and we're going to talk about those. And then we're going to talk about this concept of governance as leadership. Some of you who have been on some of our prior webinars where we talked about governance, you will see, you'll recognize this. It's the idea of what as a board member, what your primary kind of thought processes and roles are. And then finally, we're going to look at 6 best practices for high performing boards. But one of the things that I want to start with is just kind of the idea, we're all in schools, right? And so in schools, we talk a lot about students that are either low performing, they're kind of B students, or maybe they're A+ students. And I think that boards are the same. I think we can take a look at boards and go, are we a failing board? Are we just a low performing board? Are we kind of middle ground, kind of going with the flow? Or are we really a high performing board? Are we an A+ student? And I felt like this was a good kind of example, since what we do is schools, to kind of take a look at ourselves and go, what kind of student are we as board members? What kind of, what is our grade? And hopefully we all want to be an A+ student. We all want to be an A+ board. But sometimes we think we're an A+ board, and actually what we are is a B+ student, a B- or a C+. So I want to start with the vital signs, because I think the vital signs will give us some structure as to what it looks like to be a really great school, and what parts of the vital signs are the board's responsibility. So in this slide, I love this slide because what it really talks about is that schools have obligations to a variety of different institutions. The first, of course, is state compliance. We as schools, if we're a licensed daycare, we have licensing, we have TEA, and or whoever it is that's the things that are coming down from the state. We have all kinds of state compliance that we have to make sure that we're doing right. So to me, that's kind of the bottom. That's like the baseline for what we should be doing in a school. Up beyond that is the accreditation. Some schools choose to get accredited. When you choose to do that, you kind of raise your standards, and those standards become a little bit higher than the state compliance. And those are the things that the SAES is your accrediting association. Then we're going to be the ones kind of handing down those standards and making sure that you're kind of at the top of your game. And then finally, at the very top are the vital signs. And these are characteristics that high performing schools share. I know that probably everyone has heard of Good to Great by Jim Collins. It's a great book. He did pull out one of those, take that book and kind of talk about nonprofits, which I think relates better to schools. But the whole concept of that book was, I want to find out what the very best companies are doing to go from just good to go to great. And that's what I think schools can do. When we look at the vital signs, we're asking ourselves, what are the very best schools doing? And what are those benchmarks? So what are the vital signs? The vital signs kind of all revolve around 6 different areas of a school, and what the very best practices within those areas, right? So you can look at marketing and enrollment, you look at facility, the program, the advancement, the governance, the financial management. And you'll see here, and we're going to come back to this slide probably later, but you're going to see here that not everything in the vital signs is the board's responsibility. A lot of this is operational, the program operational. The facility is typically operational. Now there'll be some things within the board that would be a facility, but primarily that's the operations department. So the things that the board is going to be responsible for are things more around financial management or governance. And so we're going to talk about these things, and then we're going to talk about what that looks like within the 3 areas that we like to encourage boards to do. So this slide is a slide that the National Association of Independent Schools puts out a trends book every single year, and they update it every year. And what they do is they go in and they look for the different trends that are happening in education. And these are some of the areas that they look at. And as we kind of get through this, we're going to talk a little bit about what does that look like for boards, how do boards use trends in making decisions for their schools. Did you guys, Andrew, did you guys as schools look at at the trends every year?
Yes, absolutely. And had benchmarks for most of them and compared our benchmarks to similar schools.
Right, right. And it's really important because this, I would say that this, and we're not going to focus, we have a webinar around the trends, and it kind of changes every year because trends change. But I think it's really important for the board to think about this. This is something that is a board question. What is happening in education that we need to be paying attention to? So what is the role, the basic role of the school board? Well, again, the National Association of Independent Schools puts out another document called Principles of Good Practice for Schools. And I really like it. It's for all kinds of areas of a school, but this is what they say about the role of the school board. The board is the guardian of the school's mission. It is the board's responsibility to ensure that the mission is relevant and vital to the community it serves, and to monitor the success of the school in fulfilling its mission. And I think it's important to note what it does not say. You know, it does not say that the role of the school board is to hire teachers, or to worry about, I always use the example, and it's probably just from my own experience, where we hang the backpacks, where we put, things in the hallway, or why we're doing that. That's not what it is. The role of the board is that you are the guardian of the school's mission. And I really love that, because it kind of puts you in a kind of a larger, kind of a 50,000 foot viewpoint, and asking the question as the operational things begin to happen, what is it that we're doing here that and how does it affect the mission, right? So many of you have seen this slide already. This slide is from a book that was written by Richard Chait and William P. Ryan and Barbara Taylor. And it's a great book. I have it. And it's a textbook kind of read. But what it basically talks about is that board members as leaders, their duties kind of fall into 3 different types of thinking or duties. Fiduciary duties, strategic duties, and generative duties. Okay, so fiduciary duties or fiduciary thinking would encompass things like making sure there's an audit, or risk management, or safety, security, and health. Strategic thinking would be around the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Setting goals. What are our 12-month goals? What are our 24-month goals? What are the strategies to get us to that? Looking at the trends that we just talked about. And then the final one is generative. And that's asking the question, what have we not thought about? What is not, what are we not considering? It's funny, you look back now, Andrew, and we go, generative thinking would have been, what's going to happen? How are we going to handle this if we're in a pandemic, right? That's just not something anybody would have ever thought of. And yet, imagine if you'd had actually done some generative thinking around that. How are we going to make sure that we're still here for our children's children? That would have been really helpful. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to consider 8 of the vital signs that we just talked about, and how those vital signs fit into the best practices of 6 best practices of high-performing boards. These are things that I believe boards should really be paying attention to as they're asking themselves questions about, what is my fiduciary responsibility? What is my strategic responsibility? What is my generative thinking around this issue? And so these are the vital signs to consider. Now, remember, there are 13 vital signs. And really, vital sign number 13 is a financial management vital sign. And so underneath that, there's some really specific benchmarks that we're not going to go into tonight. But what you should know is that these are the ones that relate to boards. Some of them relate to the school, the head of school or the admissions office, but these relate specifically to boards. So I'm going to touch on the first few, and then Andrew's going to touch on a few. And then we're going to go into detail. So just know that you're going to get this, and and if you have questions as we go along, feel free to ask them. So number one, the boards need to be paying attention to the faculty salaries. They need to be paying attention to what we're paying our teachers. I can tell you this is one of the areas that I feel like there's a real disconnect between boards and school leaders. I don't necessarily always think that boards realize that we're not paying this benchmark to our teachers. Has that been your experience, Andrew?
Yes, often what a school may think it's experiencing is difficulty in recruiting teachers, but then it often turns out that it's a compensation problem. Certain kinds of teachers are not applying for positions because the salaries are not competitive.
Yeah. So this is something I think is really important for boards to pay attention to. Also, professional development is a significant investment. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but making sure that we're putting enough money in the budget for professional development. And one thing that I would remind our participants here tonight is, as board members, if you are a board member, the budget is your job. Passing the budget is one of your big jobs, and making sure that when the budget's presented, you're asking the question of, well, how are we doing with that? What's the benchmark? How close are we? Another one is making sure that the size of the admin staff is adequate. We have a lot of schools that need a lot of help and are not necessarily always equipped with the right number of staff. Another one is the board understands and supports the Episcopal character of the school's mission. Episcopal identity, definitely a board concept. It's definitely something that you need to be thinking about and asking questions about. So Andrew, you want to talk about the next few?
Yes, 9, 10, and 12. Mary Catherine and I could do a webinar on each of them. They're so important. Let me give you a preview. Number 9, I break into 5 pieces. The board has a clear understanding of what is expected of it as a whole and individually. So if you go to those NEIS best practices that Mary Catherine's been talking about, they have 12 best practices for individual trustees, and then they have another 12 best practices for boards. And it's often noted that you cannot be a highly functioning board, even when you follow those 12 best practices, if each individual trustee doesn't understand and perform the individual responsibilities of each trustee. And Mary Catherine and I will go into a little more depth in that a little later. Number 10, the board has a fair and constructive process for ongoing evaluation of the head of school and the board itself. There are actually quite a few templates for head evaluations and board evaluations, but the most important piece of the head of school board evaluation is making sure that a small number of good agreed upon goals are set as the school year begins. And then in April and May, the evaluation follows those goals specifically through the evaluation, and similarly for the board. And then the last point I'd make on number 10 is that when you agree on what is going to be evaluated, you have to resist the natural intuition to want to evaluate everything that's out there. You really want to focus on what you've agreed to evaluate on the front side. And then often the results of the evaluation turn into the goals for the following year for both the board and the head. Mm-hmm. So the evaluation itself is the springboard for planning for the coming year. And then number 12, Mary Catherine's already talked about this earlier. Every board should be engaged in a strategic thinking. And sometimes, as Mary Catherine said, it's 1 year, 2 year, it's often 5 years, but you always should be somewhere in the process of coming up with a strategic design. Mary Catherine, would you like to do the 13th one?
Yeah, this is a big one because this vital sign is really definitely a board kind of duty, and that is to make sure that the financial management is professional, timely, and includes oversight. Now, here's what it's not. We're not asking you to go in and manage the day-to-day operations of the budget. What we're saying is that as a board member and as a full board, it's your job to make sure that everything's taking place correctly, that there are reports, and we're going to get into that in detail in just a minute. But we've talked about this quite a bit in the governance and leadership and governance webinar. We've talked about it in the trustees, the school treasurer webinar. I cannot stress it enough that that's the primary fiduciary duty of the board. So let's talk about, so we've talked about the vital signs that we believe are important. And we've talked about kind of the way boards should be thinking, either fiduciary, strategic, or generative. Now I want to kind of put them together. And I want you to think about, as a fiduciary leadership, what are the things that I should be paying attention to? What are the best practices with regard to fiduciary leadership? So practice number one. High-performing boards ensure that financial resources are allocated in a way that gives the school what is needed to be the best it can be in both the present and the future. Now, that's a big mouthful. And I know that a lot of this slide deck is a lot of words, but partially I did that because I wanted people to be able to print this off and take it and take a look at it and be able to go back and look at it. But here's the thing. The board is responsible for passing the budget. And so what happens often, Andrew, is that the business manager and the treasurer and the head of school will get together and they'll create the budget, because that's where it should begin. And it'll work within the finance committee. The finance committee will work on it, and that's the way it should go. And then it's presented to the board, and the board says, sure, looks great. And oftentimes people don't ask questions. And we're going to talk about that's a best practice, in my opinion, of a high performing board, is that we are asking questions and we are knowledgeable, so that when a board member, for example, if something comes up and they have somebody asks them a question of the budget, they should know the answer. Will they know exactly the dollar amount that's in the facilities line item? No, of course not. But they should know, do we make faculty and staff salaries a priority? What are we paying our staff salaries? What are we paying? Are we at that benchmark of 85 to 90% of the local ISD? I think that's really important for board members to be able to answer that question. Basic benefits are offered and enhance the recruitment and retention. That's the vital sign. We should know as board members and ask the question, what kind of benefits are we giving? And are we giving benefits? And if not, what is our plan to get there? And so what I'm suggesting here is that as part of your fiduciary duty, you should be asking the question about faculty salaries. You should also be asking the question about, are we developing a big enough budget for professional development? And I will tell you, as a former head of school who worked with enrollment that went up and down, what do you think was the first thing that I would look at when our enrollment went down? Professional development, because it's a big number. And I would think to myself, oh, God, that's big. Maybe I can cut the budget here and we'll do something for free. And what I'm suggesting is that high performing boards they push back on that, because they know that, as you said earlier, the faculty and staff, the ability to be able to recruit the very best requires money. And it requires that we're paying a competitive salary. It also requires that we're giving great training. And so I think school heads are I know I was notorious for, that kind of being the first thing that I looked at. And I appreciated it when my boards pushed back and said, let's find something else. Let's don't cut there. That's too important. And then the final thing, and I think this is something that boards really can help with, is this idea of making sure that there are funds available for providing an adequate leadership team. This happened, again, this is a personal story. This was with With me, I, for my first 4 years, was the head of a school that had 300 kids, and I had a business manager and secretary, and it was too much. But I didn't know that was too much. And I was lucky to have a board that said, hey, we think this is too much. We think that's too many kids for just one administrator. We're going to put this in the budget, and we want you to hire an assistant. And it would have been much harder for me to go to the board and say, gosh, I need help. But the board saw that as their role in making sure that there were funds available and that we had enough people on our leadership team to properly run the school. And it's a vital sign. Thoughts on that, Andrew?
I think you're right on, especially with the idea that if you cut positions, the school may not function well. Human resources is often one of the first positions cut. And in these days, even a small school needs some help in human resources.
Yeah, for sure.
CFOs cannot do it all.
Yeah. And we see that a lot. And what I would say that, the thing that I would say to, our board members on this call is that sometimes it takes the board going to the head of school and saying, we think you need more money in this area, or we think we want to make faculty and staff a priority. Usually the heads of schools are really pushing for faculty and staff salaries to be high. And the way you can support them is say, yeah, we think they should, let's have a plan. But all of these are things that boards should be involved in. So practice number 2, high performing boards ensure that good financial management is taking place. So what does that look like? There's a couple of ways that I think that you can take this. Number 1 is, the vital sign 13 says financial management is professional, timely, and has regular oversight of the finance committee, the board treasurer, and the full board. So the first thing you could say is, do we have a finance committee? A lot of times we don't have a finance committee in our schools. That comes as a surprise to me often, but I can't tell you how many times I've had people say, oh, we don't even have a finance committee. You should have a finance committee. You should have a board treasurer, and they should be routinely kind of delving into the finances with your head of school and your business manager. And then the full board should see the big picture. And I think that's really important. And this is something that you as a board member can ask the question. Are we looking at the financials every single month? Is it transparent? Are we talking about risk management? That's one of the vital signs is risk management. Are we taking a look at are we reporting the audit every year? Every year we did the audit, and we would set in September the meeting and we invited the whole board to come to the audit review. And listen to the auditor tell us what was going on. And I think that's important. Did everyone come every time? No. Do I wish that they had? Absolutely. Because I think the board should be listening to that. The other thing on 13C and D and K, are we maintaining a financial dashboard, a historical financial dashboard, so we can take a look at how have we been doing over these years? One thing that I think is really important too, that isn't really in the vital signs, but it's something that I ran into a lot. The school should make sure, the board member of high performing boards make sure, this kind of speaks to what we just talked about the making sure there's adequate staff. You should be making sure that there is adequate funds available in your budget for a business manager, even if you are a small school, even if it's part-time. Because the head of school needs to be doing the head of school job. And every school should have somebody that's keeping the books and managing all of that. You should also make sure that there's professional development for the head of school if necessary. And what I mean by that is that there are often times our heads don't understand finances. They didn't come from a financial background. They don't have a business degree. They have a degree in education. That's what they want to do is be an administrator. But in our schools, in independent schools, you have to know the budget too. And so if your head of school needs support there, ensuring that there's money available for him or for her to go and get that help, or even if it's just the treasurer is offering that PD, giving that the opportunity is really important. Did you have thoughts about that?
No, you're just absolutely right.
Good. Okay, let's go to practice number 3. And I know Andrew has some lots and lots of thoughts about this. High performing boards take seriously the evaluation and support of the head of school. And I know this is something we talk about often. The idea of creating a head support and evaluation committee, of setting goals. These are all just really important things that really high performing boards are doing. And what I find often is that the low performing boards are not. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I would like to dig deeper here, especially in the last 2.5 years during COVID and during social unrest. So much more pressure has been put on heads. No matter what judgment call a head makes, there are going to be a significant percentage of people questioning the decisions. So therefore, it's never been more important for the board to support the head, especially publicly. And the beauty of an evaluation and support committee, as Mary Catherine is saying, 20 years ago, there probably wasn't a committee that was evaluating and supporting the head. They thought the full board would do that, or just the board chair. But the development of the evaluation and support committee of the head allows a smaller group of people to study the evaluation much more closely and then do more education for the full board. But it allows for some discrete conversations to be held in a small group, and then the board can come around and support the head publicly overall. But the evaluation allows, as I said earlier in the podcast, allows some generative thinking about what the school hopes to do the following year based on the evaluation.
Right.
And similarly, as Mary Catherine was talking about the board understanding the budget on a monthly basis, it's by understanding the variances in each budget item as a year goes by, allows each trustee to start to understand where there are opportunities for savings and which budgets really need more funding. So that's why a real evaluation of the head, the board, and the budget is critically important.
Yeah. No, and I think to your point about that committee, a lot of people don't realize that there's more to that head support and evaluation committee than just evaluation. I used my head support and evaluation committee regularly to brainstorm ideas that might have been terrible ideas. If I'm being honest, I needed a space in which I could go, here's what I'm thinking. And there was again, the discrete group of people that could support me, or even so, not just my ideas, but things like if I was having a hard time, and I had some hard times. It's a difficult job that we do, and especially now. So the idea of supporting the head through this committee is one that I resonate with really deeply, and I think is really important. And then the setting of goals, critical.
And Mary Catherine, I'm seeing more and more head evaluations involve a self-evaluation as a first step, because a highly functioning head of school is going to be smart enough in the self-evaluation to not only be talking about the accomplishments in the year, but also self-identifying areas where the head and the administration can do better, and having that conversation emanate from the head and the self-evaluation is a really healthy way for the head and the board to talk about goal setting for the future. So it's not the board coming to the head and saying, oh, we found here are your deficiencies. What are you going to do about it? Instead, you have the head saying, here are areas of opportunity for growth and improvement. I would like next year to do the following to make the school a better place and to help me be a more highly functioning head of school.
100%. And I think also, you know, especially as we develop that kind of relationship with our head support and evaluation committee, then what you begin to do is you feel free. I did this every year where I just wrote kind of what's going well, what's going really poorly, and what do I need help with? Because again, back to the whole concept of you're in charge of the budget. If I know, this actually happened to me, I had in my early years a really messed up situation with a teacher. She quit in the middle of the year, and I didn't handle it poorly, but I didn't handle it great because I didn't know. I just didn't know what I didn't know, and but it opened my eyes to the fact that I needed training in that type of HR management of teacher type situation. And I needed it. And I went to the board and said, I need this and I need you to pay for it. And they did. And it was that's kind of a drastic analogy, but the reality is that if our heads can feel comfortable to go to the head support and evaluation committee and say, hey, here are the areas that, yeah, I think have done really well but here's some areas that I would love to get some more training on, then that committee can then work with the board and create the necessary funds to get the head what they need, and everybody wins. So cannot stress practice number 3 enough. Really critical. So we've talked about fiduciary leadership. Let's talk about strategic leadership. So strategic leadership, this is kind of a more practical thing. It's probably something that you guys are probably more familiar with because most boards are doing some sort of strategic thinking. But the vital sign is that the school and the board are engaging in strategic thinking on an ongoing basis. So as Andrew alluded to, it's either I personally think that, strategic plans ought to be looked at and reviewed every single year. Sometimes you create a strategic plan and then next year you look at it and go, gosh, COVID hit. This is nothing. None of this is going to work. So constantly being under the thought process of we're a strategic board and we need to make sure that we're doing what, goes back to that idea of being the guardian of the mission. This is a really critical and a practical way to do that. And I think that the very best way to do that is to insist upon a board retreat of some kind every single year. I personally think it ought to be done in the summer. That's when most everybody is available for a longer period of time. It can't be a 1-hour meeting. This idea of a board retreat or a leadership retreat, you can do it yourself. You can bring in a consultant. Doesn't really matter. But what are the things that you should do at that? Well, first of all, you should look at the industry trends and how these are affecting the school. Back to that trends idea, if you read the trends book, and you're a preschool, not everything in the trends book is going to apply to you, right? But some things are. What are the trends for preschools? What are we seeing in the community? What are we seeing with our competition? Reviewing those every year and how they may affect you is something that takes time. Another thing you could do and should do is review and update any SWOT analysis data. This is, again, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is kind of what Andrew said about the self-awareness of the head. This is self-awareness of the school. What are we really good at? What are we struggling with? What are the things that are happening in our community that are opportunities, or what are the things that are threats? Those change. And so to only look at them once every 4 years when you decide to do a strategic plan is just not helpful. Another thing, review the most recent strategic plan and update goals. That's a really practical way. But the reality is, if we're going to set a plan, just like the head of school sets goals and then goes back and reviews those goals, the board should be taking the strategic plan and going, okay, what have we gotten done this year? And now what are we going to do going forward? And best time to do that is in the summer before the year starts. reviewing the strategic financial plan that goes with the strategic plan. One thing that I think is really important is this idea of ensuring that the Committee on Trustees is intentionally and strategically cultivating board members. What do I mean by that? I mean that this committee is asking the question every single year, who do we need to be talking to for the next year? So let me give you an example. When we did a capital campaign, we did a $3 million capital campaign with the church. And it was it took us a year and a half just to do feasibility study and all of that. And then we got into the campaign, and then so it was a long time working with that. And so each year we would take a look at the board and go, who do we need on the board that will help us with the planning phase? And then we're building, who do we need to be thinking about that could be helpful on the board as we build these buildings? And that's what I mean by being strategic in who you're cultivating. Another kind of approach would be if you're kind of doing some new kind of technology, maybe you've got an IT person that could be super helpful. I just think that that's an ongoing thing. And then finally, when you have new board members, it is critical that those new board members be onboarded onto your board before this board retreat. Because when you onboard new board members, you're talking to them about the basics of what it means to be on your board. The board retreat is this higher strategic thinking. And so if they don't know what the bylaws mean, or if they haven't seen a budget and, kind of done all those things that you would do in an onboarding time, then they can't be, they're going to be lost in that board retreat. So that onboarding, I think, is really important. Did you guys onboard your board members every year?
Absolutely. We also often use the annual retreat to do some generative thinking about setting goals for the board itself.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. So this practice would be, this is a practical way, a leadership retreat every year is a practical way to keep that priority of strategic thinking in front of the board. So you mentioned generative, let's talk about generative leadership. So, generative leadership is this idea that we want to be asking the questions, what should we be thinking about? What should we be talking about? What's coming down the pike? And when you talk about generative, there's a couple of practices that I think are important. The first one being that you are ensuring that the Episcopal identity is a priority of the school. And I know that you feel strongly about this, Andrew. This Episcopal identity really matters, and it is the board's job.
I find myself talking to boards at SAES about the challenging times that schools and society are facing right now. And being an Episcopal school helps with those conversations. I quote one Episcopal school head regularly when he said, an Episcopal school joyfully embraces the most complicated challenges of the world. The Episcopal identity can help us think about what we're dealing with in ethical ways, collaborative ways, ways in which we respect the opinions of others, and we draw on our natural compassion as an Episcopal identity in ways that can help us through some of the most challenging conversations that we're having as a board, as a school, as parent bodies question school administrations.
Right. And it is, especially in a parish day school or a parochial environment, this is critical, and it's the job of the board and the administrators to be able to understand what Episcopal identity is and to make it a priority. So yeah, I agree. The final practice is practice number 6, that high-performing boards ensure that there is time on the monthly agenda for generative conversations. Now, again, a generative conversation is asking the question, what dilemmas have not arrived? What do we need to make sure that we do today to ensure that we're here 50 years from now? It's about sustainability. It's about what's coming, what could come. And the thing about generative conversation is that you can never get to it if you're always in the weeds, right? You're always talking about the school gala next month, or what are we going to do about the fourth grade trip, or whatever we're going to do about the sixth grade fundraiser. I mean, these are not things that move the needle for the school from a generative standpoint. We need to be asking the question, what is coming and what do we need to be prepared for? Vital sign number 9 says the board members that they recognize their strategic responsibility for the continued viability of the school, and they avoid becoming overly involved in daily operational matters. So I've got about 3 ways that I think you could consider getting more generative conversation happening in your board meetings. The first is just the idea of a consent agenda, kind of going through the process prior to the board meeting of, sending out information that people need to maybe vote on. Maybe it's a quick policy, maybe it's, taking a look at the financials, whatever it is, just making sure that we kind of tick off the things that we can in a consent type form, so we get that done very quickly. Another thing that I think creates a good opportunity for generative thinking is to create a culture on your board for robust conversation. This is not something that's real easy to do these days. It feels like people are a little bit afraid to say things, and that's sad to me, because I think that the very best ideas come when you're able to take your ideas and put them out there and, kind of rub up against each other and ask questions and learn more about a different perspective. This idea that we create a culture that promotes that will create more generative thinking, if that's the culture of your board. And then finally, including time in the board meetings for mini executive sessions. What I mean by this is that some generative conversations are difficult and complex and take time. And so to decide ahead of time, hey, we need to make a decision about adding a middle school. And we've got lots to think about. We've got lots. So for the next 3 months, we're going to have executive sessions the next 3 months where that's going to be the topic. And we're going to discuss those. We're going to put that aside, be prepared to stay after the board meeting for 30 minutes, and we're going to have these mini executive sessions. Please note that when I talk about executive sessions, the head of school should always attend those, unless it's about their evaluation. If it's an evaluation session, obviously they shouldn't attend that. But all executive sessions should be attended by the head of school. Andrew, do you have thoughts on this particular slide?
Well, Mary Catherine, talking about the idea of planning for the future, the generative conversation that identifies a direction that isn't clear to everyone. I put in the chat a quotation you shared with me, Mary Catherine, a couple of months ago that I've taped to my wall, and I give it at every governance session. And it is, your responsibility is to protect the future from the present. Because what Mary Catherine is saying is, if you're only talking about the present, if you're only talking about going down a rabbit hole, you'll never talk about the future. And an example that a trustee shared with me the other day, he was talking about being on the board of one of the top liberal arts colleges in our country. And he said the board, through generative thinking, discerned that the college does a bad job giving undergraduates advice on career. And he said, and one of the important things about the liberal arts college is we're not a professional school. We're not preparing kids for a particular profession, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't be doing better counseling with kids and giving them more resources on where to turn with life choices. So this liberal arts college made one of its 4 strategic goals is to improve counseling at that particular college. That's generative thinking.
Mhm.
That's thinking about something that wasn't on the radar. That's that, maybe we should think about a preschool. Maybe
Yeah.
we should think about international students. Maybe we should think you need time and space, and you've got to get out of the weeds to do it.
Yeah, and I think again, if we're thinking about being a high performing board, we're staying up here, always looking at at what's coming. I said as a head of school, and I believe this to be true specifically as a head of school, is you got to keep one eye down and one eye the other way. We're looking to the future and we're looking at the present. So that's the head of school's role, but the board's role is really to ask those questions and to create opportunities for others to ask the questions as well.
Yep.
So yeah, I think you're right about that. So I'd love to give you an opportunity to ask questions in our last few minutes. We talked a little bit about, I'm going to go back to this particular slide, this vital signs slide. And I would, Andrew and I were talking prior to this about, we'd love to know what, if you look at these vital signs, just kind of what jumps out at you. You can put it in the chat. Probably the chat would be the best place to put it. What do you see as kind of that jumps out at you as maybe some areas that you feel like that could be improved in your board? You don't have to go in and air all your dirty laundry out. People don't like to say, but it's the truth is that for years we looked at number 1 as a board and went, gosh, our salaries are not good and we've got to find a way to do better. And that generative thinking led to it, but it took us a while. So we'd love to hear questions about these vital signs, questions or thoughts you have about anything else that we've said. I know that one of the areas that often is difficult, especially for our smaller schools, is the understanding and the Episcopal character of the schools. Understanding what that really looks like and what that means. Questions, thoughts?
Mary Catherine, number 9 on this page, the clear understanding of what is expected. I haven't seen a board that isn't trying to get better on this question. Yeah. Whether it's no matter where that board is on that continuum that you described, Mary Catherine, every board, no matter how good it is still working on number 9, trying to
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. And I think sometimes number 9 may be the hardest one to ever finally get there, because you're perpetually bringing new people on to your board and so you're starting over again about how to give them an understanding of what their job is.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. So for the trend data, you mentioned, how do board members access this information? That book comes from the National Association of Episcopal School, National Association of Independent Schools, I apologize. And it comes out every September. And I know that you can probably get it on the NAIS website. If you're not a member school, it's going to be a little bit more costly, but it is worth it, I think. You could probably contact Pat Blevins at SAES and find out kind of a little bit more information. Let me put that in there. You can contact Pat Blevins at swaes.org, and she can probably direct you if you can't find it on that NAIS website, but it's a good one.
There is an NAIS bookstore pull down on their website, and it's very prominent, and they'll lead it to you very quickly.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's all I have for that. We're going to stick around, folks. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And thank you if you're watching this on the recording. We're glad you came. And for those of you who came live, thanks for sticking around and listening to us. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks for attending.